Okay, as you know, we skipped last week in a way from the same theme that we've been developing and went off into act and potency. And so I think what I'll do tonight is to very briefly reprise some of the points that we made in the prior lectures. I mean very briefly because I know that you have them recorded. We were looking at the nature of God using the triplex via, the threefold way of causality, negation, and analogy. So that we know that anything that we find in creatures preeminently exists in God because he is the cause for anything we find in creatures. We remove any negations, any imperfections that are found in the creatures. For example, every creature is limited, so God is not limited. And then, of course, we predicate what we find in the creature of God analogously, because it is not going to be found in God in the like manner that it is in the creature. So wisdom may be found in creatures, but it is not like the non-finite wisdom which is found in God, and surely not like the rationitive wisdom which we find in man, as we go from point to point to point to point. For God, it is simply an eternal understanding. Looking at the various attributes we've already considered, I'll just run through them really fast. God is not a body, obviously, because a body is composed of matter and form. God, as the first cause, cannot be composed because there would need be a prior composing cause. Simplicity is a key concept because we have to understand that all the perfections and qualities that we find in creatures in multiple and diverse manner is found in God with absolute simplicity. All of his, what in us are distinct powers or activities, are absolutely identical to the divine substance. God is the most perfect unity which is existentially possible. You may recall a few lectures back, though, we dealt with the question of the Trinity and showed how the Christian dogma of the Trinity is not inconsistent with the simplicity of God, because it is purely based upon a distinction of relations, the terms of the various acts of procession and generation that are found within the divine substance. But all creatures other than God entail the radical composition of essence and existence, the two most fundamental principles that are found in any finite being, whereas in God, his essence is identical with his act of existence. The goodness of God is manifest from goodness that is found in creatures. And again, we have to explore a little bit what we mean by the good, what we mean by evil. This is such a broad topic that it will be the subject of a later discussion. Suffice it to point out that the good is understood as being as desirable. And since God is the infinite being, he is infinitely desirable. Evil is sometimes misunderstood as if it were a thing in itself or some positive reality, when in fact it is simply a negation of that which ought to be found in a given being or a given nature. Infinity arises from the simplicity of God, in whom his essence is existence, which means that every quality of existence is found in God without limit. If God were lacking in any existential perfection, then existence in him could not be identical with essence, because if a thing possesses some quality by its very nature, it can never be lacking in it, just as a triangle can never be lacking in the possession of three angles and three sides. Unicity just means there's only one God, and that should be evident, because if there were two or more gods, you have a problem of one having something the other didn't have, and therefore one of them would be finite and the other would be infinite. And you always can have only one being that is going to be infinite because all others are distinguished by lacking some quality or other. Omniscience means God knows all things. That's not too difficult. Using the principle of causality, we find that there is knowledge in creatures, so it must exist in God preeminently because God is infinite. It will exist without any limitation, therefore God's knowledge is going to be without limitation. What is sometimes surprising for people to realize, though, is that God doesn't apprehend his creatures as if they were objects of knowledge, but rather he knows them by knowing himself, by knowing his own essence, by knowing his own activity, his causality, his creativity, by which he posits his creatures in being. Therefore, he knows them from the inside out, as it were. He knows them by knowing that to which his causation extends. And his causation extends to every single creature. Sometimes it's a little hard for us to appreciate or understand fully the infinity of God. If you really want to think of the infinity of God, think of the infinite multiplicity of creatures. Near infinite multiplicity. Not actually, but almost infinite. Think of every grain of sand on every beach, and think of the fact that the number of stars in a galaxy and the number of galaxies in the universe added together probably exceeds the grains of sand on any beach. And in every one of those stars and in every one of the possible and probable solar systems that you find throughout the universe, there are countless individual entities, grains of sand, if you will, subatomic particles without count, and God's creative activity is present in each and every one of them. Is that not a beginning of infinity? And of course, realize that the whole created order is still nothing compared to the infinity of God, because it is finite, and the gap between the finite and infinite is immeasurable. So when we talk about the infinity of God and the infinity of God's knowledge, it really means that it extends to every single creature in all of its near infinite multitude and complexity and diversity and activity and progression through time. Well, I can describe this in words. No one can even begin to imagine it. Certainly no one can understand it. But that's what his omniscience entails. And he does it all simply by knowing himself. He cannot do it by knowing others because, in the sense of depending on them as objects, because then he would not be the first cause, because he'd be dependent on them in some manner. Just as I am dependent on you, you're dependent on me right now in order to see me. If I weren't here, you couldn't see me. But if I am not here, God still sees me. And God still sees you. But he sees you by seeing himself, and seeing himself in the act of creating you and creating me. And that brings us down to omnipotence, which is the new material we're going to start with tonight. Unless you have any questions about the prior, because you see all of these concepts revolve around each other, and you understand one in terms of another. So what we're going to look at tonight is omnipotence, which of course means God is all powerful. God has all power in an infinite, unlimited way, which means simply that he can do or make anything. How do we prove it? Very easily, because God creates creatures. The power to create is without limit, for reasons I mentioned in a prior class. If God is going to create, he is explaining why something exists as opposed to being nothing. And there is no way to measure the distinction between the potency for being and actual being. Remember, you could talk about making a chicken out of another chicken and take some power. Make a chicken out of a carrot would take a lot more power. To make a chicken out of a rock takes even more power. But to make a chicken out of nothing, there's no way to measure the distance between the potency and the act there, and therefore it requires infinite power. So the act of creation requires infinite power. Moreover, we find power within creatures. It is a positive perfection. Therefore, it must exist in God by reason of causality. Because of the divine simplicity, God's power is his very substance or essence. Because of the divine infinity, it is without limit. So again, that's another way of showing that it has infinite power. Actually, you'll find a lot of these attributes or modes of God that there are multiple ways to prove them. All you have to do is just start working way around the concepts a little bit and they come right back up. Now, of course, I remember causing my 6th grade nun a lot of trouble in this area because the poor thing, I used to ask her things like, if there's nothing between us and the moon, well, what's there? And she had a terrible time with that one. But of course, you can ask even nastier questions about God. Can God make a rock bigger than he can lift? Can God make another rock? Can God make another God? Can God do evil? Can God make the past not be? No, God can't do any of that. But God can do or make anything. Both those statements are true. And well, what's the key to that? How do you unlock it? God can do or make anything. What is a thing? A thing is being, isn't it? If you examine closely the examples I just gave you, each one of them entails a self-contradiction. God cannot make another God because, of course, you'd then have 2 gods, and that's impossible. What's impossible cannot be. What cannot be isn't a thing. God cannot make a rock bigger than he can lift because, after all, lifting it is just creating it higher and higher. Of course, he can't do that because that would mean that his power is limited, but that contradicts the infinity of his power. God cannot do evil because it would contradict his infinite goodness. Any example that you give of something that apparently God cannot do is a contradiction. God cannot undo the past. What is done, because the past does exist in its place and time. It cannot not exist in its place and time. That would be a contradiction in terms. And a contradiction in terms is non-being. If you say God cannot do a contradiction, that doesn't limit God, because what you're saying is he cannot do non-being. It's a double negation, which is actually affirming his infinite power and his infinite being. All of these examples people give. Sometimes I see this sort of thing sillily placed on the internet by some would-be atheist. As I mentioned before, these are the kinds of objections I would expect to get from college sophomores, not somebody who's professing to be an atheist on the internet. Very simple concepts, very simply misunderstood. Don't hesitate if you have questions about any of these points to raise them. Although one of the things you'll notice as we go through these, each one tends to reinforce another. So you understand infinity in terms of the very nature of God's being as a being whose essence is existence. And in simplicity is a key concept because you constantly find perfections in the natural world or in the created world which are identified with a very divine substance. And in God, all of those diverse attributes that we are studying are identical. God's omniscience is his infinity. It is his goodness. It is his simplicity. These are all simply different ways that our mind unpacks or approaches the nature of God. In God, these are all identical. I can say this. Do I understand how this is in God? No. But I can say these things, and I know that the statements I'm making are true and that they are properly predicated of God. But that doesn't mean that I understand in himself or in his very nature what this means. If I were to do that, I'd already possess the beatific vision. That's clearly not the case. Although I hope someday it might be. Immutability. God cannot change. That's what another one of those darn things that God can't do. He can't change. It seems like you ought to be, for us, we say, what's the matter with you? Aren't you able to change? Because for us, it's a terrible thing if we can't change. Because we are so imperfect, we need to change. We need to get improved. No, God cannot change. Simple demonstration. Pure act, and God is pure act, has no potency to any further act. For a thing to change, it's got to be in potency to some further act. That means it's got to be something it doesn't have. Some quality of perfection of existence that it's lacking. God doesn't lack anything. So how could he possibly gain it? Again, if God were to change, he'd either have to gain an existential perfection or lose one. If he gains one, he wasn't God to begin with. If he loses one, he isn't God when he's done. And that, of course, is why Scripture says of God, in whom there is no trace or shadow of alteration. No change at all. This, of course, and another thing, please understand that when we say God is immutable, that does not mean inactivity. It might make you think, well, he's just sitting there like a rock, doing nothing, permanently, boring life. We think of activity like a horse racing around a track, or the Indy 500, or a hydrogen bomb going off. That's what we understand to be activity, because in the physical world, activity entails change. The more rapid and violent the change, the greater the activity. The sun is active because it is constantly changing, converting hydrogen to helium, and doing other rather explosive things. But that is a meaning of activity which pertains only to finite beings, and particularly to beings in the physical world. Because in the physical world, to be active means to be changing, to be subject to motion, to be in motion. God is pure act, because think about it, when you're engaged in motion, what a creature is doing is gaining an act. Remember, motion is the act of a being in potency insofar as it is in potency. It's the act of a being in potency insofar as it's in potency to further act. So, motion is the gaining of act, which is the gaining of existential perfection, the gaining of qualities of existence that wasn't there before. But you see, God is already infinite in the possession of being, in the possession of every possible existential perfection. So God does not gain anything by motion or by further activity. What further activity would he pursue? He's already got it all. So what God is infinite activity, constant, unchanging, because the activity is always possessed, without limit. So what we think of activity is, again, limited by our limited perspective in this world, which very, very much misleads us. So God is changeless, infinite activity, which sets us up for the next property, namely eternity. This is another key concept, and we can have a lot of fun with this one. This and simplicity are the two key concepts. That, you won't find that in St. Thomas. They're my key concepts. But I find that they are the keys to understanding God, I mean, at least for the purpose of this very humble intellectual exercise we're engaged in, because we're not going to understand God, but we can perhaps understand a few things about what we can say about God. Eternity does not mean unending time. We use it that way. We talk about going back through all eternity or going forward through all eternity, or we talk about the universe as could it exist eternally. What we mean by that is unending duration. Duration without beginning, duration without end, or duration without beginning or end. Eternity, properly understood, is the name for the divine life. And it is not properly applied in the order of time and creatures. That's why they say angels have eternity. You and I, we're stuck in time. It's not like unending time, because we as creatures of time are like a pointer going through a continuum. The past is gone, the future isn't here. We are living in this little moment, which is constantly moving across that continuum. So when we think of time without beginning or without end, that's what we're thinking of. We're thinking of something which has a now point that is running through it. God, in his eternity, simply doesn't exist that way. And one of the big difficulties you'll see when you start thinking about God in relation to the world is we can't help ourselves. We keep surreptitiously thrusting God into time. We keep creating problems that arise because we're thinking of God in time. You know, like asking, what was God doing before he created the universe? Sitting there twiddling his thumbs? Did he have to check his watch and say, oh, okay, now it's time, I can make the universe? The beginning of time for the universe is a limit, a beginning for the universe. It's not a change in God. It simply means that the world had a beginning. That's all. God is simply outside of time. That's probably the simplest way to understand it. Time is part of creation. It is a limited mode of existence in which we find ourselves bound like prisoners. We are prisoners of time. God is utterly outside of time. Eternity means the simultaneous and complete possession of infinite life. Simultaneous and complete possession of infinite life. What did I just say, though? Look at that word, simultaneous. What in heaven's name does that mean? Simultaneous means all at the same time. So even in trying to describe God and his eternity, I have used the word time. And it doesn't apply to God. But we understand by it all at once. God's life, his possession of existence is had all at once. But when we think of something all at once, we think of it as that little now running through time. And that doesn't apply to God. God must be eternal. I'm looking for I was going to say the proof flows from immutability. If God cannot change, he can't even have a reference to time within himself. There can't be a before and after for him. Which leaves us in this curious position where he is outside of time, standing there, watching us go through time, knowing the past and the present and the future equally, of course, in himself, in knowing himself as the cause of created reality, past, present, and future. You're going to keep wanting to put him into time. And just when you think you haven't done it, you'll do it again. By raising some objection or some difficulty, the answer to which is, God is not in time. Time is a part of creation. All parts of time are equally present to God.
Does the phrase temporal order refer to time?
Yeah, by definition, tempus, time. I mean, you get into some nasty questions like, what was, before God created the world, could it have been different than the way he made it? You see, we always are tempted to say, before God did this or that, forgetting that the before is in reference to ourselves, not him. He doesn't have a before or after.
This is also the solution to, in some way, to the free will problem too, right? Because God doesn't foreknow anything we do; He just knows it.
That's correct. That's correct. Also, you get into the curious situation that in God, because of divine simplicity, his free will is him. Which you might ask then, well, could he have made a different world than he made? And you might argue, no, he couldn't, because we know that he's made this world, and having made this world, the choice to make this world is part of the divine essence, and that's immutable, therefore God had to make this world. But I'm beginning to confuse you. This is where you start getting into all kinds of places where you can confuse yourself, or even I can confuse myself. What we're doing there is Monday morning quarterbacking. We're saying God did choose to make this world, and since he chose to make this world, he had no choice but to make this world. But of course, that is consequent upon our knowledge that he did make this world. Now, it isn't as though he were sitting back and then decided to make this world, because that would be a before and after for him. In other words, it'd be a time he hadn't yet made up his mind, and then he makes up his mind. And you might say, well, then how can he be free? And yet he is absolutely free. He is eternally identical to his own choice. When we say he could have made a different world, what we're saying is it is within the divine essence that he could have chosen something different. But given that his choice is what it is identical to that essence, and therefore, ex post facto, Problem being the ex post facto is on our part. Given that he is eternally the choice to make the world that he chose to make, that necessarily, after the fact of that having been the choice, cannot be otherwise, but it doesn't mean that in his very nature he could not have made a different choice had he made one. But the one that he made is identical to his being. He's outside of time. See how that gets really nasty? Yeah, I mean, you could argue this is the world that he necessarily had to make, because it's identical to his being, he's unchangeable, whatever he is necessary. But it's a necessity of Monday morning quarterbacking. We know that this is what he had to do only because it's what he did do. But it doesn't mean that from the standpoint of the divine essence, he had to make this choice. He could have eternally been a different choice. But insofar as he did make the choices that he made, and watch, I'm always getting stuck because I have to use past tense in my English. I have to say did. See? You have to, from his standpoint, everything is. Everything is now. He is eternally the choice to make this world. He could have been, and that's prior to the fact, he could have been different. He didn't choose to be different. But even then, I find myself speaking in the past tense, like this is something that happened earlier. He is eternally what he is, including the choice, the objects of every choice that he's making. And that is unchangeable now, just as when we make a free choice, the object of our choice is unchangeable because we already chose it. So the free act is free in the power that expresses it. It's not free in the object that is chosen, because by the time you've chosen it, you've already chosen it. It has already been determined by the free power. Similarly, God in his being as a free being could have exercised his freedom differently, but since in fact he is eternally the choice to whatever he did to make this world, let's say, then after the fact, looking at it after we see that this is what he is, then necessarily he is this, but in himself he need not have been. Even then I say need not have been, I'm throwing him into time. It's our language constantly focuses on the past, and then by focusing on the past, because that's the way our choices are, we made it in the past, now we're in it. Because we speak that way, we focus in the past, we are throwing God into the past when he makes his choice. And he's not in the past, he's in the eternal present. He isn't even in the present, because the present is understood because it's that moment that's moving through time. The best we can do with our language is to say he's an eternal present. But the language is not up to the task. It is constantly difficult not to thrust God into time, because we are creatures of time. We are so immersed in time. As you can see, even our language is immersed in time. So we are always thinking of God being on the outside, watching what we're doing, like he's as surprised as anyone else. I ran into a process philosopher at the University of Dayton once who said that he thought, this was at some open air summer symposium for a bunch of nuns who were being subjected to it, he said he thought that God was as surprised as anyone else when the first mastodon came out of the forest. Okay. But this is the sort of nonsense you come up with when you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. And of course, you immediately have a finite God. And some people, to try to rescue God's nature, they make him finite because they just can't put these attributes together. And in order to try to put them together, they wind up creating a finite God. Some do it quite explicitly. But of course, you've immediately lost God. The amazing thing to me, as I mentioned before, is that old Santa Claus proof. The concept of God holds together. That you actually can piece the metaphysics of it together if you hang on for the ride. Many people simply get bucked off so early that they abandon the concept of God. And they say God is impossible. And that's, again, you'll find these websites on the internet of atheists who say there's no way to believe in God because such a being is impossible. And you can refute that simply by going through the divine attributes, step by step by step, and seeing how they fit together and how, in fact, they remove the objections. But if the mistakes people make most readily have to do with divine eternity. They are constantly thrusting God into time. It's almost an irresistible impulse.
But in a certain sense, how can we help?
We can't.
Well, I was looking for the principle that something is known in the matter of the recipient. What's that?
Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver.
Right.
Yeah, and therefore we understand God as we are. It's the same reason that we're all materialists. Because everything we know through our senses. And that's why many people, when you talk about the physical world, they say, I believe in the material world. I believe in things I can, feel and touch and taste and smell. And they don't even realize what they've done. They've identified the physical world with the sensible world. The physical world is far more than the sensible world. The physical world extends to anything that has parts outside of parts, that is in the space-time continuum, and 95% of what's in that continuum we aren't able to sense, because our senses only pick up the limited spectra of these 5 external senses. That's all that we get. So we are natural-born materialists. Not even realizing the inconsistency. If you're really going to just be a sensist, you shouldn't believe in photons or quanta or radio waves or anything of the sort, because you don't sense any of them either. And so too here, we filter everything, just as we filter things through our 5 senses, we filter everything through our experience of time, because we are creatures of time, trapped in time. And it's inconceivable to us, as we'll see shortly, like with the problem of freedom, how can God already know what I'm going to freely do? But we'll get to that later.
Is there any language then that we have? Is the language that we would have access to talk about God? Is that only through mystical life, or?
Well, not being a mystic, I haven't got a clue.
Okay.
As far as language is concerned, every language I know has tenses.
Right.
And that's enough to reflect our perpetual confusion. That's why we just can't imagine in non-temporal terms. And again, remember, and that's why you see arguments about people, that people make about whether the world was eternal. And of course, even if the world was eternal, it wasn't eternal. It merely means it had endless duration. That's not eternity. Eternity is the divine mode of being. It's the divine life.
Is endless duration the same as perpetual? Or is that another concept? So
That sounds close enough to me, unless you're thinking of perpetual motion.
I think it was, I read Boethius. I think he makes a distinction between the eternal and the perpetual. I think it's the same as the one you're making between continuous duration and God's eternity, if I remember it correctly.
I confess at the moment I don't remember it at all.
Okay.
But I do see the distinction
Okay.
that when we talk about an eternal world, it really
Because
is.
I think he said that the world could have been perpetual, but it couldn't be eternal, if I remember correctly.
Well, that would certainly seem to fit the distinction.
Uh-huh.
So as we look at some of these other attributes, keep in mind that God is eternal and what that means. Otherwise, anytime you start thinking about God and you say, this doesn't seem to make sense, check eternity. Check to see if you're surreptitiously sticking God into time. Let's take up omnipresence. That's what you hope to get at Christmas. It means that God is present in all things. Actually, the first time I ran across the text in St. Thomas, the article, he raises the question, is God present in all things? And he says, yes. I thought, my Lord, he's a pantheist. But then he immediately makes the critical distinction. God is present in all things as a cause is present to its effects. Not meaning that God is spatially located in things, not meaning that God is identified with things, created things. Only that God is present to all things by his creative causality. The same way he knows everything, because he knows himself creating everything. In a way it's simple, but overwhelming. The proof, of course, is simple. God creates everything. This is not pantheism. So God is present everywhere, at all times. And again, it gets tempting to not slip into some kind of pantheism. For God to be present in a special way, this of course raises the question of God's presence within the Eucharist, which of course is then a true presence in even a physical sense. But his presence in the entire order of creation is simply a presence of power, a presence of making things to be. And of course, in that sense, he is surely present to us in the most intimate portions of our being. And every atom of our being is at this moment being sustained by his creative causality. Again, remember, and of course it's a very simplistic early problem, that some people think of God as if he sort of creates things and then they run on their own. And of course they don't. That is the argument that sometimes people make when they think of God, say, creating the first things, even the first living things, and then somehow they proceed to evolve on their own. If you accept some theory of evolution, it seems like you've gotten rid of God. And of course, no theory allows you to get rid of God, because God has to not only create, but to conserve what he creates. That is to say, he must continually create. Creation is a continuous activity. If God were at any moment to cease to create us, we would just cease to be. And even though we have spiritual souls, we could, metaphysically, cease to be. That's a wretched thought, isn't it? Because God could simply withdraw his creative act. Now, of course, the reason that is impossible, I said it's metaphysically possible, but it is ultimately not, because it's morally impossible that God would have created a being which exists by its own form, spiritually, naturally, which would mean it would be naturally not subject to corruption, and then he would make it cease to be. It would be contradictory to his own intention. So you don't have to worry about disappearing overnight. You'll be here in the morning one way or another. May not have your body, but you'll be here, or you'll be somewhere. God is a person. God is personal, meaning that God is a person. Obviously, God is a person because the meaning of person is drawn from Boethius. Boethius was the one who gave us the definition of person as the supposit of a rational nature. Supposit is the foundation in a substance for whatever it is. So, for most of us, the word supposit, you can equate it with substance. A person is any being that has a rational nature. Now, rational does not mean ratiocinative necessarily. That is to say, we are rational in the sense that we not only have understanding, but our understanding is a pretty limpid kind of understanding, because we have to go from point A to point B to point C. We have to go through a process of reasoning. The meaning of rational here is any being that has intellectual understanding. God clearly possesses this because we possess rationality. Causality says if we've got it, then God's got to have it, but God doesn't have it the way we have it, because if he had it the way we have it, he wouldn't be God. We have to reason to conclusions. God's known from all eternity. There aren't any conclusions for God. He simply understands everything. The notion of a conclusion is something you have to reason to it, and you don't get to it till you get done with your reasoning. God simply is a simple act of intuition of all things. One act, by the way, one simple act, knowing the infinite myriad of created objects. Mass. How is that possible? Given the multiplicity of things that are created, how can God be completely simple and know them all? Not for that matter, create them all. It would seem like it takes a separate act of creation for each thing, just as a separate act of understanding for each thing. See the nasty little problems you can get into? But the multiplicity is on the part of the object, not on the part of the knower, not on the part of the cause. If you wonder how is that possible, you've got to realize God is a spiritual being. Spiritual beings don't work the way we do. When we handle multiplicity, it takes a multiplicity of our physical things that we're working with to handle the multiplicity of physical objects. But even in our animal nature, not our intellective human nature, but our animal nature, we are capable of apprehending objects of knowledge in a simple way. For example, if you look at this whiteboard up here, you can imagine like it's a wide TV screen, so that you not only see the height and the width of it, but imagine, I don't need it, it's okay. I need the screen itself. Unless you want to put about 300,000 pixels up there for me, I don't think you can do that, nor can I. When you look at a TV screen and you see the picture that's up there, it's actually composed of hundreds of thousands of little illuminated pixels. You don't see the individual pixels, unless you're awfully close to it. You step back and you see the picture that is depicted upon it. And in that picture, you see the top and the bottom and the right and the left all simultaneously. How do you do it? That's pretty tricky, isn't it? Now, you do it in one act. You see it as a whole. If you didn't see it as a whole, you wouldn't recognize the wholeness of the objects that are on the screen. You wouldn't recognize the wholeness of the screen. And in perceiving it as a whole, that means you have to unify it. How do you do that? You're not even God, and you can do it. you do it. You simultaneously see the top and the bottom and the left and the right hand side of that screen, don't you, when you're looking at it? And you grasp it in one act of perception. And so does a dumb bunny rabbit. And a horse. This isn't even beyond the level of sensation. This isn't something that only man can do. Beasts can do it too. So in one act, you are apprehending what is in the physical world, multiple, composite, and extended. You are able to do that, and a bunny rabbit's able to do it, because your soul has immaterial sense faculties. Sense faculties. I'm not even talking about the intellect. Sense faculties. They're non-material. If they were material, it would operate the way that all material recording devices operate, namely by having extended matter, say like a plate of film, on which one part represents one object, another part represents a different object. That's how it has to be done. That's why your computer has a limit as to its memory, because it can only handle so many bits of information, every bit having to represent some external data. Physical representations are one-to-one. And that's why if you're trying to take a picture of something and you put it on the TV screen, you do it by having hundreds of thousands of pixels illuminated, in which each pixel is wholly a given color and represents some bit of color in the object that is being recorded. Because that's the only way to do it with a physical camera or recording device. And in that case, each pixel represents one little part of the image or object. And just that one little bit. That's all that it knows. So if you talk about knowledge, and it doesn't even know that. The problem is what sees the whole picture. The only thing that can see the whole picture is a living, sentient being. The pixel down at the bottom here has no, quote, knowledge of what the pixel at the top is doing or knowing. And that's why we talk about the simplicity of sense perception. Sense perception. The multiplicity is on the part of the object, but simplicity is on the part of the subject knowing. As a living, animate being, you apprehend sense objects that are multiple, but you apprehend them in a simple way. As an intellective spiritual being, you can apprehend multiple concepts and understand them in a simple act, as when you compare one thing to another. Comparison means you've got to know both objects at the same time. So there's multiplicity on the part of the object known, but simplicity on the part of the knower. That's even in us. Ergo, in God, in one simple act, he apprehends and creates all things. The multiplicity is on the part of the creation. The object's created, the object's known. The simplicity is within himself. How is this possible? I haven't got a clue. You have to be God to know it. But we don't have a clue how a dumb bunny sees the top and bottom of a carrot at the same time. All your scientific explanations don't answer that one. They don't come near it. They don't begin. They're talking about something else. Talking about bits of phenomena, they're doing this and that and so forth. But they don't address the philosophical question of how the whole is apprehended at once. Oh, they'll try to tell you that you're involving multiple parts of the brain at the same time. But if that were the case, You have the same problem you do with all the pixels on the screen. You have one part representing one part, one representing the other. What gets the whole? Getting the whole means unifying the perception. And you can only unify it when you get all parts at once. You know those old TV screens, I've mentioned some of this to you before, those old black and white sets where you achieve the multiplicity of the picture by having this electron tube scanning rapidly back and forth across the screen. Ever notice what happened on those old sets? When you turn them off and the vertical and the horizontal fields collapsed, you got unity, didn't you? What'd you get? You got a bright dot in the center of the screen. Good picture, right? There's unity. In the physical world, you achieve unity by destroying the intelligibility of the object perceived. To perceive the object, you must continue to perceive its complexity and the distinctions within it, and yet grasp them all at once in a simple act. Science is not explaining that stuff. And I haven't got a clue how it's done, but I do know that God made sensitive creatures that can do it. And they do it by reason of the sensitive form that animates their being. Just as we understand multiple things by the intellective form, which animates our being. And analogously, God understands all things in a simple act, which is his very essence. And that same simple act of understanding is identical to his act of creating them, and it's identical to his free choice to create them from all eternity. Watch that, from all eternity. Went to the past, didn't I? Can't talk that way.
I was thinking too that our Lord talked to us that way as well. I mean, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire. And that.
Well, everlasting you could take as just being. Oh, you mean because he is speaking?
Yeah. He's
He has
giving
to.
it to us in the manner of the recipient.
Yeah, that's all that people can understand. Well, I think if I hope I don't have direct experience of this, but I think that you will have a progression of experience through that everlasting fire. So that is not eternity, but it's sure going to feel like it. Okay, I think we'll stop for tonight.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.